Welcome to Slight Reliability, learning SRE one day at a time. I'm Stephen Townsend. Welcome back to Slight Reliability, the show where we learn SRE one day at a time. Today I'll be interviewing Ganesh Datta, who is the Chief Technology Officer of Cortex.io, which is an organization who builds software to help manage microservices. So here's the interview, and hope you enjoy. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me and come on the show today. I guess the first thing I was interested in is a bit of an introduction on yourself and your career so far, and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here. I'm Ganesh. I'm one of the co-founders of Cortex. I started my career 6-7 years ago at a startup called Up. They were in the fintech space, doing credit cards and loans and things of that nature. I joined right as when they were starting their whole microservice journey, like the very first microservice they pulled out. Like I was working on that team, so it was definitely a unique experience there, and got to see that very first microservice all the way up until around 100 microservices by the time I left. So definitely got to see a different scale of the organization, and our engineering platform and stuff is there. Getting a chance to do production readiness checklists and service maturity standards and all that stuff, and that was kind of how I ended up starting Cortex. I've been working on Cortex for about 3 years now, and that's how I got here today.
So you co-founded Cortex. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Cortex is?
Yeah, absolutely. So Cortex is basically a platform that lets engineering teams understand their microservices and then actually improve those microservices over time. More tactically, what that means is we have a couple different products, mostly centered around service catalog being a way to track all the services that you have in your organization, what they do, metadata about them, like ownership and on-call and runbooks and all the things you need to kind of operate your microservice architecture. But then also kind of getting into how do we establish best practices and standards and help engineering organizations really adopt that culture of accountability and ownership. And so with this scorecard system that lets you define those best practices, and then give each service a score saying, how mature is a service, is it meeting our standards, and then helping engineering organizations move that forward. Outside of that, things everything from scaffolding services using boilerplate generation to reporting and all that stuff. But this is kind of like the core feature set of what we do.
In your experience in the past, what particular challenges did you find around microservices architectures, or just the sheer number of microservices in the organization you're working in? What are the kind of key challenges that you saw then that I guess were the driver for you to form Cortex?
Yeah, it's cool because it's one of those cases where it definitely was like a personal pain point that led me to start Cortex, and I think it's because I got that opportunity to see that change from that first service to 100 services. A lot of things are different. I think obviously like your platform tooling is different. The complexity of observability and monitoring is a lot different. You can't just throw your logs somewhere and hope for the best. Like you need to start tagging your logs with the name of the service, the environment it's deployed in, and trace ID, so you can do request tracing across different services. And if one service in your chain doesn't do that, then it becomes hard to actually piece everything together. It was hard to understand things like ownership. If you have 50 services, you get alerted for something and you're like, hey, I have no idea which service does X, Y, and Z. I don't know which team's working on that. I don't know where the code is. I don't know where the runbooks are. And so eventually the knowledge that you have as a small team, all working on the same code base, breaks apart, and you start creating this tribal knowledge where individual teams know about their services, but then not really much outside of that. And I remember specifically when kind of I thought about Cortex was, we had made a lot of improvements to our development platform where it became very easy to spin up new microservices. We'd invested a lot in the deployment pipeline, in templating for being able to spin up new microservices. And so there was a week where I think we spun up around 4 or 5 microservices, and I was thinking there's got to be some way of tracking this stuff somewhere, like some sort of automated tooling. And so I was playing around with microsites and Swagger and all this stuff to see if I could generate some hub of here's all the microservices we have and what they do. But there wasn't really any good solution for that. And I remember asking my co-founders who were at Uber and Twilio at the time, Uber obviously being the classic case of microservices gone wrong. They had thousands and thousands of microservices. And asking them hey, what do you guys do? You obviously must have a solution for this because you're running at it at a much higher scale. And I was like, no, we don't really have anything much better than this other than like slacking people. And they build some internal tooling to like track ownership, not much more than that. So I think those are the kind of things around how do we just keep track of all the stuff we're building, but then bring some kind of standardization to say like, hey, we want all of our services to do things a certain way, and we want to track ownership and all this stuff. And there was no good way of doing that. And so that was how we ended up starting work on Cortex and building these specific products today.
That's cool. That sounds like quite an organic flow into here's an opportunity and we can fix this. And yeah, I like that.
Exactly.
And obviously this podcast has got the theme of site reliability engineering, or SRE. Is SRE and parts of that, like service level objectives, something that you're seeing your customers or that you yourselves and your organization are adopting?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's interesting for us is we end up working with SRE teams a lot. And I think the reason for that is they are the ones tasked with, hey, we really care about reliability as an organization. This is a focus area for us. Let's put in place the standards and the tracking and the monitoring to help us achieve that as an engineering organization. So the SRE team is the one that comes in and says, like, here are the things we care about. Let's set these standards. Let's help engineering teams understand what they mean and then drive adoption of those things. And so they kind of use Cortex as a tool to do that. And so we end up working with a lot of SREs who are thinking about these things around, okay, like what does it mean to adopt SLOs? How do we want to drive adoption of that? Do we care about SLOs as an organization? So it's definitely something that we see a lot of. And I think every organization is in a kind of a different part of that journey, or they have very different perspectives on what that means. But yeah, I would say like SREs are kind of our bread and butter, and like the SRE mentality is definitely a part of, what we do best. Yeah, I think what we're seeing is that they eventually succeed. It's like kind of overcoming some initial inertia, iterating on what really matters to those organizations for SLOs. Like I think what happens is you end up seeing like, oh, like all these companies are doing SLOs. It sounds really important to us. Like we should probably do it. And then you start trying to do SLOs, whatever that means, and then you kind of learn, hey, actually, this is what we're trying to get out of SLOs. Let's take a step back, come up with some sort of strategy for how we're going to do it, and then start chipping away at that. And so I think the best organizations that are doing SLOs really well have this kind of like bottoms up groundswell adoption of SLOs, where it's getting developers to understand, hey, why do SLOs matter? They matter because it helps us kind of have some sort of North Star for the things we care about. It makes it easy for us to understand reliability and these metrics, report up into engineering leadership and say like, here's the things we're trying to track and improve, and holding ourselves accountable to these things. But it only works if like individual service owners and those teams are kind of defining those SLOs themselves. Like, if you're building a payment system, like your SLO may not just be uptime, but it could be, number of payment transactions that succeed. Like that could be your objective that you're trying to uphold. And so it really depends. Like if the service owners are the ones that are creating those SLOs, it's more likely they actually adhere to them and care about them and will improve those over time. And so I think that's what we're seeing the best organizations do.
I really like what you said about the North Star to know, make sure you're going in the right direction. I think that is, I'm starting to come to the conclusion that is perhaps the real purpose behind SLOs, and I like it a lot. And there's lots of other benefits as well. But as I've experienced, it's much harder in practice to make SLOs come to life, and I think it requires a lot of things to be in place. But that's a discussion for another time.
Exactly. Yeah, I think even things like getting business folks to pitch in, like it's not just an engineering thing, right? It's like SLOs are important because reliability is important. Reliability is important because the business is important and the customers are important. So SLOs can't just be defined in isolation from the rest of the stakeholders. Like they mean something to somebody from a business standpoint. So why not loop in like your product stakeholders and say like, hey, what is important to you from a product standpoint, from a business value standpoint? I think when all those things kind of come together, that's when SLOs really start to shine.
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, I guess Siri doesn't understand, but yeah, it's one of those things where I think like if everybody kind of comes together, then it's easy, like you said, for that North Star to, hey, let's all work towards this and hold ourselves accountable to that. I think that's what it comes down to in the end.
I've been thinking about that recently, and there might be, say you've got a business objective to grow a certain number of customers maybe in the next 1 or 2 years. Maybe that's your business objective. And then we start talking about how reliability feeds into that and actually quantifying that. I like to say, well, if we reduce the response times of of the service or this web experience by a second, is it actually going to make a difference or not? And have you ever seen or heard of actually quantifying that, or the connection between technical reliability metrics and achieving business outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's definitely something that we think about a lot. And in fact, we had an opportunity to do like a fireside chat with some of our customers. And one of the things that came up that I thought was really interesting was reliability for them was not even like a proxy metric for some sort of business value. It was the thing because they were trying to move more and more up market into enterprise. And then for enterprise, like you're committing to certain like SLAs, legally binding SLAs. And so now you've given yourself basically like, we are committing legally to this number of uptime, and that is going to help drive X million dollars of revenue because that's what the enterprise unlocks for us. And so that's like a very easy example of like, there's a very, very solid single number that you can point to and say like, hey, we closed all these enterprise contracts because we were able to commit to this SLA. The SLA then is in turn kind of driven by all these SLOs and SLIs that we have. But then you kind of have like the intangible ones. If you're a consumer company where you're building an app, I think it's pretty well studied now where it says, if you have response times under a certain threshold, then, the churn or bounce rate is much lower. And you can say like, okay, if the bounce rate's lower, then that leads to X more people in the funnel, and then therefore our cost of acquisition goes down. And I think you can kind of math yourself to some sort of hypothesis around that value proposition. And even for companies at our stage, I think, we get feedback all the time, and at least we used to, saying like, hey, this part of your app is kind of slow, it's not super performant, or this part is not really reliable. And that builds up over time. I think it's harder to quantify that, but you can say like, hey, like if X customers churn, or like you're able to close these contracts because they had a very stable, rock solid experience, or people renewed at a certain amount, then yeah, that you can kind of point that back and say like, hey, these investments we made in tracking our objectives like really paid off in this way. So I think there's definitely like different levels of quantification depending on kind of where you are as a company and what kind of products you're selling, but it's definitely possible. And I think the best SRE teams and the best teams that are driving SLOs push themselves to do that because it helps them in two ways, both kind of manage up, as we say, like in terms of getting agent leadership buy-in, to say like, hey, look, here's our general back of the napkin math around why this stuff is so important. Like we need resources to help us drive this reliability stuff forward, but also to get developers to buy in and say like, hey, here's why it's important. Look how much value it's going to bring to the organization. Like let's all pitch in and do this together. So I think there's still a lot of value regardless of doing like very rough calculations as an SRE team to try and quantify that.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think the business context matters a lot as well. So a lot of these studies which were done, I think, around drop-off rates and latency were probably focused on maybe that retail space or maybe a public cloud space or, those kind of spaces. Where I currently work in insurance, and it's a lot about trust with customers, and they don't care so much necessarily about the latency, but they want to know that what they're doing is secure and they're getting the best price and those kinds of things. So I think it can depend on that too. And so there's no sidestepping it, going in and doing your own analysis, I think. But that's the fun bit, I think.
Exactly. Yeah, and like that's a great example where it's some like in those SLOs then would be more around like correctness. Like how do you like track trust as a metric? And this is something we actually did at LendUp where we would have like metrics that we were tracking and alerting on, which is around how accurate are the calculations we're running on our loans. Like if we're making mistakes on how we're computing interest or payment schedules and whatnot, then that is a very, not only a poor customer experience, but that's like you're kind of out of compliance now. Like that's the only thing you do as a business, and if you can't do that right, then what are you really doing? And so a lot of the stuff we were tracking was around like correctness metrics as opposed to latency. When you're applying for a loan, you don't really care about like, hey, did this take 3 seconds or 5 seconds? Like that's not super important, but like if you were accepted, do you get the right numbers? Did we do the computation correctly? What is the failure rate on these things? Are we dropping things along the way? Those are the things that matter to us way more than, yeah, you got your response in like 5 seconds or less type of a thing.
So I asked this question of Sebastian Feets, who I talked to last week, and I'm going to ask it again. So SRE has obviously gone pretty mainstream in recent years. Organizations all over the world are creating practices or roles, at least with the term SRE in the title. What sort of challenges do you see in the world of implementing site reliability outside of Google?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is well phrased, because I think what a lot of organizations are doing is saying like, hey, the Google SRE handbook says X, Y, and Z, therefore we should do it, without kind of contextualizing what really matters to them as an organization. So I think that's going to be the challenge. One of the things that we see a lot is there's this kind of like burden placed on SRE teams where an organization realizes reliability is super important to us right now. Like, it's going to drive X dollars of value. Let's hire an SRE team and they're going to solve all our problems for us. But like, that's not really what SRE does. Like, SRE is kind of, setting the grounds and the standards and stuff to help the organization get there. Like, you can't really do it without the rest of development. SRE can kind of assist in that. Like, I view as SRE, it's almost like a consultant role where they can come in and say like, here are the things we're tracking today. Here's the thing we should be tracking. These are the best practices we should be adopting. We're going to be like a first line of defense to help us get there. But, over the long term, we want our developers to start thinking about this as well. And I think that's the biggest challenge, is both for engineering leadership to understand like, hey, it's not just hire an SRE team and they're going to fix everything for you, but it's hire an SRE team, give them the charter, and then help them get buy-in from the rest of the organization to do the things that matter to get there, to help SRE accomplish their goals. And so I think it's going to be like coming to terms with the fact that it's a cross-organization, all hands on deck type of an effort to get to the place where you want to be. You can't just place the burden on usually like an understaffed team of like 5 or 6 people to do that at a company with like 100 plus engineers. So I think that's going to be one of the core challenges that teams face, is like creating this culture and like, getting people to buy into this culture of reliability and accountability and ownership, and making that like kind of a force of habit.
And culture change is extraordinarily difficult, as I'm sure we're all
Exactly.
aware. Yeah.
Exactly. And there's so many things obviously you can do to get there, and and without like diving into Cortex too much, like that's one of the things that we try to do a lot. But it comes down to, there's like aspects of gamification. Like, SRE teams will kind of start with auditing all their services and like putting some metrics maybe in a spreadsheet, and then they'll like point service owners to that spreadsheet and say like, hey, look at this thing, like we're kind of out of compliance, like let's fix this thing. But it doesn't really convey the message as to why does this matter? What is the highest priority thing for me as a service owner? Like, I have 15 things I got to fix. Which is the thing that I should be focused on? Like, which is the most high leverage thing? And like SREs are kind of like running after people and pinging them on Slack, and like it's a lot of like this manual overhead. And so I think there's a lot of things that can go into creating this culture, fostering this environment. Everything from like making it clear what expectations are around service maturity and reliability. So instead of developers being like, oh yeah, that service sucks, no, here's why, like here it's out of compliance in X, Y, and Z. If you improve on that, then therefore this service meets a certain like service maturity threshold. Gamification of things like that. We talk about this thing where you can like move a service through a ladder of rungs, like bronze, silver, gold. Like, you can accomplish the gold level of maturity for your service, and something to show off. People put those like code coverage badges on their GitHub repos. Like, why not treat reliability in a similar way? Like, people do want to show that stuff off. But then also from like engineering leadership buy-in, so kind of highlighting improvements and like during all hands meetings, like, hey, congratulations to team X, Y, and Z that had like the biggest improvements on their service maturity standards. Like, these are the top 5 teams that are like, doing the best. Like, it's kind of like giving visibility to this and saying like, hey, as an organization, like we're trying to make it clear that we care about this. Like, this is something that's important to us. I think those are the things that over time help foster this environment of reliability and get developers to buy into that as well.
Do you think that when you add in sort of maturity models and that kind of thing, that it can sometimes lead to sort of gaming the system in order to get the result, as opposed to, an output rather than outcome kind of mindset? Or is it, I think mostly gamifying it makes it more fun and interesting. I agree with you there, but I have seen situations where people game systems because there's a quantified thing and they're like, I just want to achieve that, as opposed to the actual outcome.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a risk of running that, and I think it comes down to how that's communicated to developers. Like, if engineering leadership's like, oh, this is going to be part of your performance review, then yeah, I would give the hell out of that too, because that doesn't make any sense. But if it's more of like, I think developers do care about service quality. It's not that they don't care. It's either they don't have time, they don't know what's expected, they don't know what service maturity means in an organization. Maybe they don't have visibility into their services, but developers care about code quality. And that's why you hear developers talking about like design patterns and principles and all this stuff all the time, because like we do treat it as a craft. And so I think developers, if they see that, like, hey, here are the things you could be improving for your services, I think they'll just naturally do it. And the gamification is just more of like a fun incentivized way of doing that. But I think generally I'm an optimist when it comes to like developers and best of intentions there.
What do you think some things are in the industry that we're not currently doing very well? And that's a very open-ended question. It doesn't have to be focused on reliability. It could be anything to do with technology and the way we deliver and operate.
Yeah, I think we're doing better at this now, but I think there was definitely like a shiny object syndrome type of thing for a while. I think now people have started to understand like if you choose a shiny thing for too long, then you're the one that's on call for it, and it's going to suck eventually. So I think developers are kind of incentivized not to go with the shiny thing too often. I think that was definitely a challenge for a while. Like, I remember like the mean stack was a whole thing, and like everyone was trying to use MongoDB and like whatever was cool at the time. But I think we've kind of tapered that out. I think in terms of like just actual like engineering practices that I think is running rampant, I think people talk about ownership a lot, but I don't think people have really solved it. Like, it's very much treated as an afterthought. I think some companies get very religious with like code owners files, and that's kind of it, but not giving a lot of thought as to the fact that like teams are always in flux and people are changing and there's reorgs, and how do you keep that information up to date, and how do you go back and reflect these things that don't run into like orphan services, and especially now with like the Great Resignation, that we're leading to a lot of tribal knowledge is lost when people leave, and that you don't really know like what is affected when that person leaves because you don't know what things they own or what things they've touched. And so like I think one of the things that we need to do better at as an industry is just like really coming to terms with the people related challenges of our craft. I think we've done a great job of understanding all the technical complexities. I think microservices is a great example of that, where when microservices first became a thing, we spent a lot of time building out all the tooling to make it possible. Like, we have service meshes and API gateways and great distributed tracing tools and Kafka for event streaming and Kubernetes and all this stuff, like, to make microservices as easy as possible. But the flip side was microservices introduced all of these like organizational challenges around, we don't know what people own, best practices and standards and all this stuff, and that was like a human problem. And so I think, especially as software eats the world, cliche, but like every organization becomes a software organization, every organization ends up running into the same like people related challenges of software engineering. I think really thinking about that and like kind of probably doing more research onto what that means to build good software, and like what are the people implications of that, how do you account for those things, how do you build good systems around tribal knowledge and documentation. I feel like we haven't done a great job of really researching documentation. Like, what is the best kind of documentation? Like, is it should people be writing docs in code? Should people be writing Confluence pages? Is it like technical specs and API specs? Like, I don't know. Like, everyone has like different opinions on things, but those are the things that drive like a people-driven process. And I think that's something that as industry we could probably be doing a lot better on.
Completely agree. The human side is the thing that is maybe the hardest to grapple with, and in some ways is the least satisfying for engineers to think about, because they want to have a technical thing they can just solve and it's easy and I write some code and it's done. Whereas the people think it's an ongoing, fluffy, messy thing to work through. But at the same time,
Exactly.
It's very interesting to me because it's so difficult to solve those problems and to work through them. What do you think the single biggest challenge that SREs face in the world right now is?
That is a great question. I think there's a lot. I think SREs are definitely given a lot of responsibility and a lot of things that need to change. But I mean, the thing that we see the most is so many different ideas on what good means. Like, you have 12-factor and DORA metrics and SLO adoption, all these things are like, oh, SREs, like, you got to be doing this and you got to be tracking this, and modernization strategies and cloud migrations and all this kind of stuff. But I think really just kind of, again, like the shiny thing problem that we just talked about, I think SRE is kind of facing that in a very painful way, because whatever metrics you decide to start tracking now will kind of entrench themselves in your organization. And so I think SREs are going to have to grapple with, how do I mix and match all the things across all these different methodologies and trains of thought into something that really matters for us? And there's just so much information out there, because I think SRE in the grand scheme of things is a very new thing, and like people are building SRE teams for the first time. And so if you are joining an SRE team for the first time, or your organization's just done it, there's just like a fire hose of information you're trying to suck in, and like every team is doing things differently. So how do you distill all of that and like make sense of the chaos in the world and come up with a plan that actually will help you accomplish your goals? I think that's going to be a very tough challenge for a lot of SRE teams to deal with. And I think most teams will figure it out just naturally iterating over time. But yeah, dealing with that fire hose of information is definitely going to be going to be tough. And we talk about this in like software engineering all the time, like analysis paralysis. You think about like, oh, like, is this design architecture like better, or this other thing? Like, what do I do? Like, I think it's very similar. And like, I think with design principles, you have some standard practices now, but for SRE, we're still kind of iterating to like a baseline set of practices. And I think that's the biggest challenge that SREs are grappling with.
Yeah, it sounds almost like the bottleneck at the moment is also the capacity of the human mind, because there's only so much that one individual or even one team can contain, and the less frameworks and sort of understood and proven methodologies there are, the more difficult it is, because you've got to invent things for the first time, or there's so much stuff in the air.
And you spent 6 months talking about DORA metrics, and then all of a sudden you read a new article, like Google's like, hey, we're giving up on DORA and we're like doing something else. And you're like, oh man, like, what do I do now? Like, am I supposed to like switch to the latest and greatest? Like, but I think, again, just distilling all of that into like, hey, what are they actually trying to accomplish? And it comes down to the human mind, our ability to process all that information.
All right. So we're going to finish with a very silly question, just to get have a bit of fun. Would you rather be able to move things with your mind, telekinesis, or would you rather be able to read people's thoughts?
Oh, that is a great question. I think I would rather be able to move things with my mind. I think it's because reading people's minds would probably be creepy, and I would probably get sad knowing what people are thinking. But more from a spectacle standpoint, I feel like people are like, you're making it up. But if I'm moving something with my mind, they're like, man, did you really move that thing? But then I can also make use of it to do cool things. So yeah, I think I'd want to be able to move things with my mind.
Massive thank you to Ganesh for coming on the show. I really enjoyed our conversation, and some of the topics that we talked about are things I'd like to elaborate more on in the future, such as the gamifying of reliability, for example. I think it's a great idea. So thanks again, and thank you everyone for tuning in to Slight Reliability. I'll be back next week with more content, and we have more interviews coming as well. If you're an SRE practitioner and you'd like to come on the show, I'd love to have you. So reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter, and let's connect. See you next time.